Hey, good afternoon, everybody. That was a great talk on the stress response. It is really bright up here, speaking of stress response. Can't hear me? All right, we'll stay close in. So this one is going to be on iodine. And this has been a big topic here in natural medicine over the recent past. And it's probably one of the most widely studied minerals over the course of the last century. Huge, huge factor on thyroid health, big factor in overall requirements. And what's happening is that we are headed towards some deficiency states of it. Some people do run low in it. And at the same time, there are some guidelines that are popular that are calling for extremely, extremely high doses of iodine. So we're being pulled on both extremes. And there is a reality, we do need some, just a little bit, more than some folks get. And we'll go into details on all of that. So this is relevant to me. My main practice focus is thyroid disease. And as of the last several years, I've had new patients, probably at least a couple a month, that have come in because they've had thyroid disease triggered by iodine overdose. This was one of the first ones. A guy named Bob, dear, dear sweet patient. You know, I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona. We have a lot of people that are seasonal. We call them the snowbirds. They come down for the winter and they leave, go to nicer places when it's hot in Arizona. And he's like that. So a lot of these folks, I get reacquainted with them every 6 months or so. And this guy's been just a model of practicing all the things that we preach. He's reading all the things that we read. You all have patients like this. And suddenly one year he comes down and he's got some really obvious hyperthyroid type symptoms I was suspecting. You know, he did an exam, worked him up a little bit, ended up doing an uptake scan. Turns out he's got toxic nodular goiter. And I really wasn't expecting that. You know, I do see this every so often. It's most common for someone who's on amiodarone or someone who's had high-dose iodine for a contrast medicine. Those are the common triggers. And I asked him at detail about what had happened. Was there some kind of a trigger? Had he had an imaging study done? And he hadn't. And finally, towards the end of a longer discussion that was kind of fruitless, he mentioned that he had been taking a new iodine supplement. And this really piqued my interest. I said, oh, okay. So we learned that he'd been taking 25 milligrams a day for a few months after being found to be deficient by a challenge test. And that was just before this started. So that's one scenario. I've seen a lot of folks like this. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there's folks that really are getting too little. The general paradox about the deficiency states of iodine are that fewer foods have it because we were getting too much in the mid-70s to early 80s. So some aspects of the food supply had iodine ratcheted back. And the other issue is that we're not getting as much iodized salt because we're eating out. And in general, salt that we find in pre-made foods is non-iodized. So we see folks like Sarah. And I think a lot of our more holistic type patients can be typical of this in some ways. They're often not eating as much processed foods, and they're also commonly using sea salt. So those two together, she didn't really have a stable basal dose of iodine. Plus she was vegetarian, so she was avoiding a lot of foods that do have a bit of it as well. And we found her to be hypothyroid, and on the workup she had a pattern that we'll go into, which is pretty classic for this occurring from iodine deficiency. And this is the big trigger for thyroid disease globally. You know, right now we have about 1 billion people on the planet whose brains haven't gotten to full capacity because they were exposed to too little iodine early in life. It's a huge thing and it's a huge problem globally, but it's not as big of a factor for triggering thyroid disease in the US for the general population. But some folks like her it is. And we'll go into some of these patterns. We'll commonly see TSH elevate, free T3 elevate. The body will actually overcompensate and scour every bit of free T3 out of T4 that it can. And then we can see thyroglobulin high while antibodies are negative. And all together, with a dietary pattern like hers, this is one more of iodine deficiency. So she went on not to need long-term thyroid replacement. So here's some key starting facts. The terms iodide, iodine, pretty interchangeable. We can see goiters from too much or too little iodine. You know, both ways cause that. And same thing about thyroid disease. You know, we can get hypo from too much, hypo from too little. Same thing about hyper. We can get that either from too much or too little. Here's a fun one that a lot of folks don't realize. Desiccated thyroid actually has iodine, and it's got a substantial amount. So a 1 grain dose is about 130 micrograms of iodine. So when our patients are on Armour or Nature-Throid, they're already getting a substantial amount right there in the thyroid. And back prior to the 80s, that was how we assayed and standardized desiccated thyroid, was by the iodine content. The problem turned out to be that there's a lot of iodine not contained in the active hormones in desiccated thyroid, which can be variable. So you can have desiccated thyroid pretty well dialed in for iodine content, but yet still have the hormone levels be variable. So after 1980, the testing changed to assay it based upon free hormones, not on the iodine content. Wrong button. Okay, here's a few more good ones. So iodine added to the salt, and this is in foods that have it fortified. Many types of salt don't have that. And the bulk of the salt we get nowadays, we're getting from pre-made foods from packages or restaurants. And we'll talk about a really funny exception in a bit, but by and large, that salt is not iodized. So here we are getting far too much salt for our health, but we're teetering towards getting too little iodine.